Back for her second appearance on the podcast is Jude Southerland Kessler, the author of the John Lennon series. It's the only historical narrative on the life of John Winston Lennon, and her latest volume is titled Some Forever, Shades of Life, Part 2. Jude, it's great to have you back on.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much for having me back again. We had a great time last time I was on the show, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, another phenomenal job on the book, but also thank you for including, I saw my name in the book. Thank you. I was like, okay, I wasn't expecting that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I mean, here's the deal. If you just write the book, what is the point? You have to sell the book. And so that part that no author, because most authors are very reclusive. You know, I dreamed that being an author was having a steaming cup of coffee with the sunlight streaming through the window. You know, you're writing. It's not that. It's standing at conventions. It's standing long days and talking to strangers. And that's something most authors really are shy about doing. And going on podcasts and telling people about the book. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's the difference. Most self-published authors sell 80 copies of their books. It's because you got to get out here and do this, you know?
I remember we talked about that last time. And it's, if you do self-publish, if you have the type of personality that you have and you go out there and you talk to people, that's great. Now, the other side of that is, yeah, some people don't want to do that, and because it isn't fun. So I try to make it fun. I try to make it enjoyable for those who come on.
You do. I watched so many of your podcasts, and I must say it was rather daunting coming on the show after Alan Kozin. I was like, oh my gosh.
Oh yes, Alan. Yeah, so many amazing Beatles authors.
Yeah,
so many of them out there. So, and so many books on the Beatles, but this one really dives deep into John's life. How many volumes do you think you will have by the time you're done?
I'm supposed to do 9, but to do that, I'm probably going to have to do more two-parters because, you know, with this book, with 1965, the first book, Shades of Life Part 1, was yay thick, and it was half of the year. And so this new book, which is 800 pages, so it's the same size, a little bit larger than this book, is the end of the year. Well, there's no way I'm going to make 9 books because we're only up to 1966.
Right.
You know, but I really wanted to stick with number nine. So I'm probably going to have to do more part 1 and part 2. But this is the cover of the new book. And my husband did the artwork again.
Beautiful job.
It just, you know, 1965, we call it Some Forever because it's a year of memories that all of the Beatles will have forever. This book is loaded. I mean, it's Shea Stadium, 65. George Harrison goes, did we go to Shea Stadium in 66? You know, it was 65 is the year they remember. That very first time in that gigantic 55,600 person stadium, sold out, packed, and they're recording a movie, a color movie of what they're doing, which was big stuff in 1965. They leave there. They go on to Houston, where fans are almost killed on the runway. The fans break free of the police, charge the plane with those rotors spinning. And then the pilot is savvy enough to just stop the engine, and he throws the Beatles and everyone out of their seats. But he's going to kill fans if he doesn't. They proceed to climb on the wings, smoking cigarettes near that hot gasoline. And the Beatles are trapped inside for 40 minutes and scared to death. But that's not as bad or as riotous as San Francisco, their last stop on the 65 North American tour, where literally they have to stop the show, both the matinee and the evening show, because the fans have crawled over one another. I mean, shades of the tragedy in Liverpool, the football tragedy. They are crushing people to crawl over them, to crawl on the stage. People are severely injured. And the ones that can't crawl up are throwing folding chairs onto the stage.
This would you say this is the height of Beatlemania, this time period?
It is, without a doubt. Now, for the press were in love with the Beatles in 64. And then when they made that decision midway through the 64 tour to land in a remote location, not to land where the fans are. That was not the Beatles' decision. They were very unhappy, in fact, furious about it. But the police said it's too dangerous. What's going on is too dangerous. So when they did that, the press turned against them.
Yeah, and that I didn't realize until reading the book, which I want to get to as well. As far as John's concerned, I'm curious, did he take to New York right away, or was it a bit intimidating at first? Because you were talking about the Rainbow Room was a place he didn't like. That made him feel small. So I was curious about that.
He liked the vibe of New York. I mean, he says later to David Sheff, I'm a water person. And I grew up, in Liverpool on the water. I like port cities and I like activity and I like diversity and I like what's happening on the street. New York spoke to him as the city that, as much as he got to see, when they first came in February of 64, they were a little bit freer. So they got to walk around Central Park and they got to really see more of the city then. But he did in places like the Rainbow Room, where you have very sophisticated people with refined taste and the food is refined. That's not John.
He felt in place in New York City. At least I remember when towards the end there in the late 70s, he loved New York in the sense that he could go for a walk with Yoko and people pretty much treated him just like an everyday guy there. I think that's what he liked about it. New Yorkers are that way.
Yeah, I'm just reading this enchanting book that Elliot Mintz did. Have you read it yet?
No.
Yoko and Me. It just came out.
Okay.
Gosh, it's so good. And it's about, their experience in California. And John and Yoko are getting ready to get out in San Francisco, en route to San Francisco to eat in a very populated place. And they're chanting something in the back of the automobile. And Elliot Mintz can't figure out what they're chanting, but they're chanting something like Fred and Ava Gherkin, Fred and Ava Gherkin, Fred and Ava Gherkin. And he's like, what is wrong with them? Well, when they step outside, that's their persona. And as long as they believe that they're Fred and Ava Gherkin, no one bothers them. The minute they sit down in the restaurant and John speaks to order food, the veil is lifted and everybody goes, that's John and Yoko, but yeah. He loved mixing with people and being on the street and being able to be normal. I don't think the Beatles realized that toppermost of the poppermost meant isolation. You're not going to do the things you used to do.
You mentioned the press. They're beginning to sour on the Beatles, and they're looking for, as you wrote, chinks in the Beatles' armor. Talk about Cousin Brucey, what he had to say about that, because he met with the band privately after the press conference when they arrive in New York.
They've traveled down that very long underground pathway from the umpire's dressing room where they've been waiting to the dugout where they can see the field. It's a long walk. It reminds me a lot of the Rocky movies where Rocky's walking in. He's got his uniform on, his entourage is behind him. You get this chill bump feel of what it's like to be going to the biggest stadium concert, the first time they've ever had a gigantic stadium concert. And, Eric, you think about back up 2 years, that's it. 24 months. What are they doing? They're playing their last gig at the Cavern Club. In August of 63, they're winding up they're still Cavern Boys. Now they're getting ready to step onto this stage, and the security is outnumbered by the fans 40-1. 40-1. So had they decided to charge the stage, nothing could have stopped them.
Yeah.
As they get to the edge of the dugout, they look out, and what do they see? Not only are the fans jumping and pounding, and you can feel whole stadium vibrating, but they are throwing their empty glass Coke bottles, which at that time were about the size of a water bottle, a little bit bigger and heavy. They're glass Coke bottles onto the field, and the Coke bottles hit the ground and bounce and hit the ground again. And John says to Cousin Brucey, Cousin, is this dangerous? And Bruce Morrow says, oh, no, John, the fans are here out of love for you, and they just want to share this place with you. And John says, are you sure? He goes, no, you're fine. Yes, you'll be fine. So Ed Sullivan leans over and says to Bruce Morrow, seriously, is this dangerous? And then Cousin Brucey says, pray, Ed, pray.
Yeah, but he did reassure them too. You're right though, because I think he was listening in on some of the questions that the media was asking the Beatles too. They're just peppering him with questions.
Yeah. And he's saying to
Yeah, they were like, do you think your run is over, or how much longer do you think you'll be around, and things like that.
the first line of the book is everything depended on the press because from today, if you have the press behind you, you are golden no matter what. I mean, you can do just about anything and the press is going to support you. And if the press doesn't like you, oh my goodness, it is a hard row to hoe. So the Beatles were beloved until that horrible decision to have them start landing remotely, and then the press is after them, and they're saying things like, and I think you and I may have talked about this last time, they say, look, you should be able to manage getting off a plane with all our taxpayer dollars paying for security to get you off the plane. And Paul's like, well, we're really outnumbered. I mean, there's only four of us and there's a lot of them. And then another reporter says, yes, but I don't see why we should have to pay to take care of you. I mean, you're young and you're strapping and blah blah blah. And George Harrison says, well, maybe you could handle it because you're fat and we're not.
Well, I love the answers that they give. You quote the back and forth between the questions from the media and then the responses from the Beatles, and it was just this rhythm to it. Like they just knew what the questions were already, or I'm not sure, or they just had it. They just had answers always ready to go. Very the cheeky humor. I don't know, is that the way you would call it? But they just had that great way of responding to every question. Some of the questions are just so silly that they just had to make a joke about it.
How do you sleep with that long hair attached to your head? George says, how do you sleep with your arms and legs attached? They are, I think the two things about the Beatles, of course, their music is brilliant. I mean, let's put the music in a box and move it to the side. The thing, because there are other groups that have beautiful music and enchant. I mean, I love John Sebastian and the Love and Spoonful. I love Daydream and Younger Girl, and so many of the songs of Love and Spoonful are great. So put the music aside. To me, the two things that push the Beatles to the toppermost of the toppermost are number one, their humor. They're so smart. They're so brilliant off the top of their head, and they didn't know what they were going to be asked. They didn't have time to see what they were going to be asked because they do a concert, they do a press conference, they do a concert, they run to the next city. There's no time, but they're just smart and they're just funny and they're bold. And like you say, they're cheeky. And the other thing is, and I hear this repeated, I heard someone say it 2 days ago about the Ringo concert. Dana Klosner, who wrote Beatlemania Lives On, said she was sitting on the front row at Ringo at the Ryman. And she said, he looked straight at me. He was singing to me. This is repeated over and over and over. He looked at me. He looked at me. There are girls from Shea Stadium that say, Paul was singing right to me. They made a connection.
Yeah. Another interesting question was posed in the book, did an animosity exist between John Lennon and Bob Dylan, which I always thought the two had great respect for each other. What did you learn about that?
Absolutely. They really liked each other and they get together many times. In fact, when Bob doesn't show up on the first night that they're in New York, he comes the next day. John is like, where's Bob? Where's Dylan? Where is he? Why isn't he here? They liked each other very much. I don't know who started that rumor that they didn't like each other. I'm sure that John was a little bit jealous of Bob Dylan because Bob Dylan could get on a stage, sit on a stool with an acoustic guitar or on some occasions an electric guitar, and he could perform and you could hear a pin drop. People were respectful and they listened. And that happened very rarely to the Beatles. In 1964, in the book Before Shades of Life, Should Have Known Better, the Beatles are doing the 1964 North American tour, and they go to Indiana and they start to sing If I Fell at the evening concert. And not only are the fans, they're screaming in between songs, but during the songs, the fans are very polite and they sit in their chairs. When they start singing If I Fell, it's hard to say this without getting teared up. the fans start singing the song along with them. You can hear it. There's a video on YouTube, Indiana evening concert, 1964, and they're singing If I Fell.
Mm.
And John and Paul are very out of tune because they're not used to anyone listening to them, and they don't rehearse in between these shows, and they're very weak and at first and wobbly. And then as these fans start to sing, they hit their stride. And it is just a magical thing. But by 65, nobody's listening.
Right. But you see the music changing with the Beatles, and I would think a big influence was Dylan. I know Lennon, there was at least a song or two, maybe on Rubber Soul or Revolver, but you know this better than me, but the songs were influenced really Dylan-esque type songs. I'm trying to remember which one, but.
There are two sides to that coin. Side number one, freewheeling influenced all of the Beatles, all of them. They had it in their hotel room in January of 1964 before they come to America. Those 3 weeks that they spend in Paris, they have freewheeling and they're listening to it. They've got a record player and they're playing it over and over and over and over. And so it influences all of them. But John Lennon was writing autobiographical songs from day one. And even before, he says to David Sheff in the Playboy interviews in 1980, David Sheff says, "Tell me about Hello, Little Girl." And he says, "Hello, Little Girl, that was me. That was my first song. It was about my mother. It's all very Freudian. I was saying to her, hello, little girl." I was fascinated with her. And he goes into this whole thing about, hello, little girl. He's a teenager. He's in the Quarrymen. He is young.
Like 16 years old. Yeah.
He's writing songs. And this is another thing he says to David Sheff. Paul writes songs about other things. Drive my car. I write songs about myself in my life. Girl, it's only love. He's always telling you the same story. He tells you that story in I'll Cry Instead, Not a Second Time, Nowhere Man, I'm a Loser, over and over and over and over. There was a girl. I loved her. His mother. She didn't love me. She didn't want me. I wanted her. She didn't want me. He keeps telling you that story to different rhythms and different beats. Sure, he writes other things. He writes songs for Cynthia, like When I Get Home, Wait, It's Only Love is for Cynthia. He writes songs for her, and he writes commercial songs. And I'm not trying to denigrate them by saying that. They're great songs, but they're written to sell. She loves you. I want to hold your hand. There's some songs that are just written to sell, but the bulk of his songs, he tells you half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia.
One more question on Shea. There are a myriad of historical discrepancies in the Shea Stadium story. Many sources say the Beatles left in an armored van. What's the real story?
They left in a white station wagon, and you can see it in the video if you watch the color movie that they made of Shea Stadium. It's very accessible. It's all over the place, and you can get copies of it. You can watch them get off the stage and get into that Mets white station wagon, and they're driven off the field in the station wagon. They come in the armored van. They enter in the armored van. Eric, can you just imagine? You're inside that van. You can't see, but you hear the screams and the pounding. And then those doors open into thousands of flash bulbs and the hectic roar of that crowd. What that must have been like to step out of the van.
Madness. Now, at the San Francisco show, they left in a armored vehicle, right? Wasn't that the story on that one?
Yeah, but you can actually, at the Beatles at Shea Stadium, you can see them go get into that white station wagon. I mean, it's right there.
Jude Southerland Kessler, the author of the John Lennon series, the only historical narrative on the life of John Lennon, and her latest volume is titled Some Forever, Shades of Life Part 2, and we'll let you know where you can get a copy. The Beatles head out on their 1965 North American tour, and they got to meet their idol Elvis Presley in Los Angeles, but Elvis stalled the meeting. Talk about why that was and then how the meeting ultimately went.
Ivor Davis was one of two reporters who was actually there. It was Chris Hutchins and Ivor Davis, and that's it. No other reporter, no cameras, nothing, no cameras are allowed. And no, these are the only two reporters. And so Ivor and I talked many, many times about this, and he said the entrance was so awkward because no one introduced, hey, Elvis, the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and here's Elvis Presley. No one did that. They're issued into the room, and I have a graph of what everyone says Elvis is wearing. Everyone has a different outfit. I spent 3 months doing the research. So I wrote to Mark Lewison and said, Mark, have you gotten to Elvis yet? And he said, not yet. And I said, you research far better than I. You know far more than I. But why reinvent the wheel? Do you want me to send you 77 pages of notes on the Elvis meeting? He said, sure, send it along. I mean, I'm sure he did his own research. He doesn't need me. He's, Mark Lewison. But when he read my notes, he said, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. There's so many discrepancies in this story. Everybody tells the story differently. But they come into that room, and Elvis is sitting on the couch playing a bass guitar. That much we know. And no one talks. They're in awe of him. John is beside himself with fear. He is beside himself with fear. In fact, he's put on this Fassbender persona from What's New Pussycat, Peter Sellers. He's speaking at what's long lives the king and all this stuff that he's doing because he's so nervous. So they just kind of sit there. And finally, Elvis says, well, if you boys aren't going to talk, I'm going to bed. And then that breaks the ice and they start to play some music. Now, George says they didn't jam with Elvis. Ringo says, well, we didn't really jam with Elvis. Paul and John both say they jammed with Elvis, and there's an explanation for that. They play one song, and John and Paul both say it's Cilla Black's hit song that she had just sung on the Ed Sullivan Show like a week earlier, You're My World. And then after they do the first song, Elvis apologizes to Ringo and says, I'm so sorry, we don't have any drums for you to play because they're back in Memphis. Ringo says, that's okay, I'm going to go play snooker, and he leaves. George gets up and goes out to try to find a reefer. So they're not in the room as John and Paul continue to play songs with Elvis. So, yeah, that's the explanation. But what an awkward meeting. They're never comfortable with each other. They start sharing some stories about things that happened on tour that were dangerous. Elvis almost crashed. They talk about their plane catching on fire and what's been going on this dangerous North American tour. That's about it. That's about all they have in common.
But he was reticent because his fame was starting to decline. So he was looking at the Beatles as this up and coming band. Did he feel threatened by them, or why was he delaying it?
Well, number one, I don't know how much Elvis knew. I don't know how much Colonel Parker really shared with him. And I don't know if it was Colonel Parker who was really delaying the meeting or was Elvis, but Elvis definitely felt upstage. And it's really not Elvis's fault because Colonel Parker had signed him to this 30, whatever it was, movie deal contract where he is to keep making Girls, 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 Viva Las Vegas, and all of these movies. And when John says to him, are you working on a movie right now? And Elvis says, I am. And he said, well, what's the plot of it? And Elvis says, I am a rock and roll singer, and I find a girl and she falls in love with me and I fall in love with her. In other words, that's the plot of all the movies. It's the same thing over and over. He goes, one time they let me deviate from that plot and the movie failed. So I'm right back to that plot. It's really not Elvis's fault, but he has lost his thorny crown, and the jesters have taken it, and it had to be a difficult situation. Then to top it all off, one of them, and Chris Hutchins says it was John, but Paul says it was Paul. One of them says to him, why don't you make songs like you used to make, the old rock and roll songs? And Elvis says, yeah, well, I might think about doing that. And that's the end of the meeting. He pretty much ends it because I'm sure he's offended.
Yeah.
why don't you make good songs like you used to make? John wanted to say it. I know he did. I don't know if he's the one or if Paul's the one, but someone said it, and that kind of was the end of the night.
Yeah, it was like a role reversal for Elvis because he had been in that position that the Beatles were in when, was it Sinatra? Didn't Sinatra have him on a TV show? And it was
Yes.
that moment of like Elvis is taking over, like the crooners are yesterday's news, and here's this new kid coming up. And now here's Elvis in that position that guys like Sinatra and Dean Martin were in. Yeah. But he was such a huge influence on the Beatles. It was like skiffle music and Elvis, those were the two huge influences. And you go back to like late 50s, right? When they were growing up in Liverpool.
Yeah, I mean, John said before Elvis, there was nothing. And Mimi used to say to him, Mr. Presley, you'll never be, because that's all he wanted to be. His early look, let's see if I have a copy of it. His earliest look was Elvis. He's trying to look like Elvis.
Yeah, there's a picture, that famous picture when they're in Hamburg this is when Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best are in the band, and they have an Elvis kind of look about him, almost like a
Yeah.
more like maybe Marlon Brando / Elvis Presley look to them.
The high hair
Right.
piled, and kind of greased back in the DA in the back. And when John's at Liverpool College of Art, he's styling himself just like Elvis Presley. That's who he wants to be.
They also hung out with Peter Fonda and the Byrds, and that's where we get to an interesting story behind a song that would end up on Revolver, which is She Said, She Said. And John wrote it after an acid trip in LA during a break on the tour while hanging out with the Byrds and Peter Fonda. What was it that Peter told John that inspired this song?
At this point, George and John are very much into LSD, and they have survived some pretty hectic experiences like that Houston ordeal and Shea. And, they are, by the time they get to LA, they just want to relax, take some LSD, walk around the pool, and chill. And in comes Peter Fonda, wasn't invited. I don't know how he got there, but he's at the party. And he starts saying, man, I know what it's like to be dead, because he had been shot. And yeah, hey, I know what it's like to be dead. And John says, no one cares. And he keeps saying, I know what it's like to be dead. Well, you're talking to the wrong person, because John Lennon does not want to discuss being dead, because his whole life is at almost 15 years old, losing his Uncle George, who was his dad, essentially. And he's sent away for 2 weeks to Scotland. And when he gets home, his uncle's dead. I mean, he's gone. And they've already buried him. They didn't even let him say goodbye. And he goes hysterical, utterly hysterical, and they can't stop him. And so they bring his mother in. She becomes the new Uncle George, his very best friend, his soulmate. They are almost never apart. And what happens? She's killed by a drunk driver. And he thinks at this point, okay, I have no responsibility to anyone because I have no one that really loves me. Mimi is decorum and do your homework and do what you're supposed to do. He doesn't feel like she really loves him. I have no one who loves me. And then he meets Stu. And Stu becomes his Julia, becomes his Uncle George, becomes his soulmate, becomes his brother. And Stu dies of an aneurysm he's only 20 years old. And he's gone, and John's lost him again. And he doesn't want to talk to Peter Fonda about what it's like to be dead. He doesn't want to talk about death. In fact, on the way to Hamburg, Alan Williams is driving them to Hamburg the very first time, and they stop at the Arnhem Cemetery, World War II cemetery, and all of the Beatles get outside of the van to go eat lunch out, sitting on the steps right in front of a sign, a memorial to the Arnhem soldiers that says, their names liveth forever. John's not in that photo because he won't get off the bus. He is not going to eat lunch in a cemetery.
Wow.
He does not want to have any association with death. And here's Peter Fonda trying to tell him what it's like to be dead. But it sticks with him. And as he begins to explore the writings of Timothy Leary, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and explore meditation and metaphysical experience. John was always searching. He was always searching for meaning in his life. Oh, I know what. Life will mean something to me if I get to the toppermost of the poppermost. Okay, well, life will mean something to me if I take this new drug. Okay, life will mean something to me if I get a new wife. Then it's her holding me back. I'll be happy if I get a new wife. Oh, well, I'll be happy if I have a hit song, a solo hit song. Cause after cause after cause after belief after belief after belief. He's looking for meaning. And so she said, he's using Peter Fonda's phrase that obviously haunted him and stuck with him, but he's reframing it to talk about a different kind of existence and the search for significance.
Fascinating. Let's get to the Rubber Soul album, which was released in early December 65. It was recorded in October and November. And you take readers through those sessions in this book. John seemed to be inspired by the Byrds. He saw them as contenders and felt the Beatles should be doing more. He's ready to put the poppy Beatles sound behind him, right?
Yeah, they all are. They all are. I mean, I think George, more than anyone, George became close friends with the Byrds when they were out in LA. And in fact, they are given a party by Alan Livingston, the head of Capitol Records in America. And it's a cocktail party and it's very lovely and all that. And George says, I'm not going. I'm flatly not going because the Byrds have invited me to go to a recording session and that's where I'm going. And he does. He doesn't go to the party. Paul goes, he doesn't stay very long and he joins him over with the Byrds. And then finally John leaves. Ringo hangs out at the party, but the rest of them want to hear this new sound. The Byrds, admittedly, they say they were influenced by the Beatles. They tell you that. And the Beatles are influenced by the Byrds. And for the first time, the Beatles aren't necessarily leading the way. They're being influenced, and then they're taking those influences and they're doing something new with them, something totally new. I mean, to me, Rubber Soul is the turning point. It is not Revolver, which a lot of people say. Right. I mean, by the time you get to Rubber Soul, you've got the sitar on Norwegian Wood. You've got the sound of world music. You have songs about complicated relationships. No longer is it moon, spoon, June, croon, people falling in love and batting their eyes and sighing. You've got people who are struggling in their relationships. Many of those songs are very serious. You've got a song about where can I find meaning in life? In the word, and the word is love. It's the precursor to All You Need Is Love. They are becoming the new Beatles, the studio Beatles that they're going to be. And imagine this. They start recording on the 12th of October, 1965, and they are finished on the 12th of November. Who beside the Beatles could do Rubber Soul in a month? And it's really not a month because when they have the MBE on the 25th, they're off for rehearsals for the MBE, and I'm sure getting their clothes together. And Brian gives a soiree for them that night. And then the next day, October 26th, the whole day is spent receiving the MBE, doing many interviews afterwards. So those 2 days are out. And then they spend November, I believe it was the 2nd and the 3rd. Yes, the 2nd and the 3rd going to Manchester to record the music of Lennon and McCartney. So they don't even have a full month.
Did they write these songs on the road?
No, they were so busy during the North American tour that they did very little writing on the road. They return home and they start writing immediately.
Wow.
And is driving out to Kenwood. And I heard someone say the other day, oh, well, why John is so lazy. Why didn't he drive into London? Well, there's a simple reason. Paul tells you in the lyrics, he enjoyed going out to Kenwood. He has about an hour's drive. It's 27 miles, but it was not on a super highway. It's almost an hour's drive. He gets out there. It's quiet. It's peaceful. You're in the countryside. They sit out on that back patio and it's a gorgeous view from where they are. Cynthia makes them tea and they have biscuits and they have something to eat later and they work and they're not interrupted by city noise or people calling them or what. It's very quiet and peaceful. Paul always comes out early. And let me say that he knows full well that John Lennon does not get up until 2 o'clock. Everyone knows that. That's when he gets up. Yet he persists in coming out at 11 o'clock. And I just heard someone snarkily say on a podcast, well, he has to come and wake John up because John is so lazy. That is not true. John wrote the bulk of both Hard Day's Night and Help. He writes some of his greatest songs on Rubber Soul. And he co-writes, if you count the songs that he co-writes, I mean, let's just look at it.
Yep.
Norwegian Wood, Nowhere Man, The Word. He helps with Michelle. In fact, it's his idea. He says, what about that old party song that you used to do when we were at Liverpool College of Art, or John was at Liverpool College of Art? When we go to parties, you would do that song. How about that one? Why don't you resurrect that? He co-writes What Goes On. He writes Girl. He writes In My Life, one of his greatest songs ever. Co-writes Wait, which is recorded in June. They thought they were going to put that on Help, but they don't. And Run for Your Life. So I don't think that's a lazy person. I think that's a very industrious person.
The Word. I love The Word. That's one of their best, I guess, deep tracks.
Yes. Yes. John had been reading this book. It's The Passover Plot. And it is about it. It's written by a very learned gentleman named Dr. Hugh Schonfeld, who it says eminent translator of the New Testament, author of the Secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Jesus the Biography. Schonfeld has a very different philosophy about Jesus. He thinks that he intentionally set himself up to be killed to fulfill all of the claims about the Messiah. That's his theory. But in writing that, he also talks about how miraculous what he was teaching was, and how this philosophy of love, loving everyone, loving the people that hate you, loving the people that say bad things about you, loving the people that despise you, was unbelievable in a world of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And it was radical. And John's very attached to that. He writes The Word based on that. Unfortunately, he quotes Schonfeld in a January 1966 interview with Maureen Cleave called How Does a Beatle Live? And when he quotes Schonfeld, as you know, that's lifted out by Datebook and put into Datebook, and it causes the summer of 1966. He's trying to put love into the world, and what happens? He ends up inadvertently putting more hatred and controversy into the world, because that becomes the Beatle bans and the Beatle burns. And
that's the We're Bigger Than Jesus.
Yeah.
That's where that comes from. Yeah.
The disciples are thick and ordinary. It's them. That's all. Schonfeld says the disciples never understood what Jesus was trying to say. They were rather ordinary. And John thinks he's being so cool to quote this best-selling book. And just before, Maureen had interviewed George, and I have what George said. He said, well, we are all agnostic. We don't really believe in anything. We always have been. He goes, I think I'm probably atheist. This is before he really goes into his Middle Eastern period. And no one cares about that. No one gets upset that he says that. It's, John always gets in trouble. They expect that anyone says anything smart, he's like, oh no, it's going to be me. And they always blame him for it. So it was just the way of his life.
Norwegian Wood was about an affair John was having?
Yeah. He sings it for the very first time for George Martin when they're on a skiing trip in early January of 1965, early in the year. He's already written Norwegian Wood by that point, the lyrics to it. Now he hones it. He changes it. He works with George, and they work on the melody and how it's going to be presented. But he sings those lyrics. George Martin was trying to outdo John. John had been clowning around, wearing a silly costume and dancing around the hotel room and entertaining Cynthia and Judy. And so George Martin goes in and puts on a crazy outfit and comes dancing out. And when he does, he steps on something, falls, and breaks his foot. So he's not going to be skiing. He's stuck in the hotel room. And to cheer him up, John says, hey, let me sing you this new song I've written, thinking George Martin's going to be very cheered by it. Well, he isn't very cheered by it because it's obviously a song about an affair, and Cynthia is sitting right there. And George Martin feels sorry for her. And she pretends not to notice. She goes on talking like she doesn't notice, but she notices. She always knew. And he says to John, that's a bitter little song. He didn't like the fact that he sang it in front of Cynthia. No one knows for sure, but it was probably about Sonny Drain, Sonny Freeman, who was Bob Freeman's wife. The Freemans lived in Emperor's Gate when the Lennons lived in Emperor's Gate. And John visited with her a lot. She was one of those smart, independent, bold women that he liked, much like Astrid, very much like Yoko. And so, that's probably who it's written about, but we have no proof.
Drive My Car, we see that songwriting partnership of John and Paul here. Paul originally sang it, You Can Buy Me Diamond Rings. John didn't like it, and then he came up with Baby, You Can Drive My Car.
He said, you just did that. We've used the diamond ring things over and over and over. It's trite. And so Paul's like, yeah, okay, well, what can we come up with? This is another one of those magical days at Kenwood where they're putting their heads together and they're really working in unison on Rubber Soul. They do this on Rubber Soul probably more than any other LP. Prior to that, it's a lot of competitive work where John is trying to outdo Paul and write a song that's better than the one that he just did. And they're trying to top each other. But Rubber Soul, they don't have very long to compose. They already have weight in the can because, they've recorded that, I think, on the 17th of June, and it's ready. So they've got that. He's got the words to Norwegian Wood, but it still needs to be worked out. But pretty much they've got to come up with 10 songs in just a few weeks. And they meet and collaborate and listen to one another, tweak what the other one has written, and look at the result. One of the most beautiful LPs that they ever wrote in such a short time.
I can't help but thinking this every time I talk about the Beatles, think about the Beatles. How many bands and artists would kill just to have one of these songs? And how many of these songs did the Beatles write that are absolutely mind-blowing? Like, how did you write that?
Under duress. They did whatever they were told they had to do. When George Martin says to John, we have to have a title song for Help, and we've got to have it by tomorrow. And he does. He writes a beautiful ballad that, if you ever hear Tina Turner sing it, it's a gorgeous ballad. No. Oh, it's beautiful. And George Martin says, John, that can't be the title song we've got to speed this up. I mean, and so they do. But if you ever hear the demo song that John did, it's lovely. And had he been able to record it the way that he had written it, it would have been his Yesterday. It was gorgeous. Oh, yeah, they tell Ringo, okay, in this scene, you have to jump off the yacht in the film of Help. You are going to jump into the water. And Ringo does it. And he can't swim. He totally can't swim. So they, say, okay, well, that was pretty good. Let's do it again. Oh, gosh. So he does it again. The third time they say, can we do it again? He said, I can't swim. I'm terrified. And they say, okay, well, why didn't you say something? The first 2 takes are fine. We'll go with those. Whatever they told them to do, they did it. And it's amazing.
I didn't realize George had a fear of flying, and he was in all those helicopters. I mean, it was torture for him.
Horrible. And John was scared too. They were both.
Was he? Yeah. Flying over Shea.
I love it where they say, we're going to tour around and look at buildings before we get there. And George says, forget the buildings.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm good. Yes.
No, thank you. He says something funny like, I don't want to get impaled on the I don't know, one of the buildings that they're flying by. I don't want to do it. Go to Shea. And every time they want to dip down and look at things, he's like, no, thank you. It is he's terrified.
Yeah.
They're terrified.
Nowhere Man, talk about what led to John writing the lyrics and what his mindset was at that time, because there's a question asked in the book as to whether or not he was expressing his battle with depression here.
There is a great book, The Making of John Lennon by Francis Kenny, that really talks a lot about the fact that if John were around today, he would have probably been a different person because he probably would have been prescribed antidepressants, which would have changed, what he was dealing with. But he tells you straight out in the anthology that after his mother died, he was not sober one single day after that. He was either getting ale somewhere at some pub in Liverpool or going to a place that he knew would sell it to him underage, or he was taking some kind of drug. He just could not handle it. It was, she had already left him at his aunt and uncle's house when he was 4.5 years old for them to raise him instead of her. Then he finds out, oh, she's living with someone else and she has 2 children and she kept those cute little girls, but she didn't keep me. So it's not children she doesn't want. It's me. So he's been dealing with quite a lot all of his life. And then to have her reunite with him and become such a integral part of his life and then have her just completely torn away again, he's dealing with depression. He doesn't know why she didn't want him. And so he keeps saying, I'm going to prove to you that I'm smart enough and I'm popular enough and I'm respected enough and people out there love me and you should have loved me. And he bases his whole life on this. It would have been different if he had gone to counseling, or if he had taken medication or something, but he doesn't. And so he's telling you in Nowhere Man, he tries and tries to write a song. He can't. He lies down and takes a little nap, and the song starts coming to him. And he starts thinking about the fact that here he is in this palace with suits of armor and a huge, one of the largest beds I've ever heard of in my life, old books, a gorilla head, beautiful collectible antiques. He has everything, but he has nothing because he is the emperor of nothing. He is a nowhere man living in a nowhere man, making nowhere plans for nobody. And this goes on and on and on and on and on, and song after song, until finally on the White Album, he sits down and pens Julia. And he tells Julia in that song, all my life, everything I've said, has been for you. It's been meaningless, but I've said it for you. But now Ocean Child calls me. And I'm singing this as my goodbye song to you. This is the goodbye. And after he writes Julia, he doesn't write another song for Julia. He is able to supplant Yoko for Julia and begin writing songs for Yoko and living for Yoko and performing for Yoko and watch me, mother, but it's a new mother. What a complicated life. I'm a loser. They all tell us the same story.
At LSD, Cynthia Lennon felt that because they're starting to drift apart at this time while they're recording these songs, she felt the LSD was the cause.
At the end of March in 65, which is in the first part of Shades of Life and Shades of Life Part 1, George's dentist invites them to dinner and puts a sugar cube into their coffee with LSD. It doesn't ask them. Can you imagine the gall of someone giving you a serious drug and not asking you? It was horrible. And John is livid. He's furious that it's been given to Cynthia more than anything. And they get in their car and leave. They're driving. Yeah. They end up going to several of the hot clubs in London, like the Bag of Nails. And I mean, everything is distorted and out of whack. For Cynthia, it is a night of terror. It's horrible. She tries to throw up and get rid of it. She can't. It's just horrible. But for John, it's magical. He sees himself commandeering this great ship and bringing people to safety in this ship. And he has this feeling of being in charge for probably the first time ever. And he loves it. He begs Cynthia to try it again. And she does. And it's just as bad as the time before. And she just says, I can't do this. This isn't for me. You can take it if that's what you want to do. And from that moment on, they're drifting apart. He goes into London. He's hanging out with a group that takes LSD. He brings them back to the house and they stay for like 2 and 3 days. He doesn't even know their names. And finally he has to kick them out.
Wasn't George was turned on to it as well, right?
George was. George, I don't know. George seemed to be able to temper it better than John because George grows up in a stable home with a mother and father who love him and a sister who loves him. And he doesn't have a need to use it to make him happy. It's an experience and he enjoys it, but it's not his lifeline. And it becomes a lifeline for John.
Day Tripper was recorded during those sessions, ends up as the B-side to We Can Work It Out. John wrote it, but he wasn't over the moon with it. Why didn't he think much of it?
Well, they ended up making them double A sides. He liked it. I mean, he thought it was a very hard rocking song, which harkened back to their early songs. And he enjoyed it. He didn't like it as much as George Harrison did. George Harrison adored it and fought for it to be the A side, period, end of story. But George was always taken up for his big brother anyway. I mean, whatever John did, he would say, "That's the best song you've ever done." And John said, "You said that about the last one." No, no, I said the last one was my favorite, but this one is your best song. So I think he liked it. He just didn't see it on par within my life.
We Can Work It Out is a great example of, and you pointed out in the book about how John is a perfect complement to Paul. Paul wrote the song, wrote it about his frustrations with Jane Asher. He comes up with the "Try to See It My Way" lyric, but then John comes up with the middle 8 part. Life is short and there's no time. And you follow with the question, is this a clear illustration of Paul's optimistic nature and John's pessimistic personality? And what is the conclusion?
They're both pessimistic. Both of them are saying they're both in a horrible mood and they're both saying things are not great. So Paul's in a fight with Jane and he doesn't say, "I'll try to see things your way," or "Let's compromise," or "Let's talk about this." He says, "Try to see it my way." Do I have to keep on talking till I can't go on? He's not in a very upbeat, happy, uplifting, positive mood. I don't know where people get that. And then John comes in and says, "Look, you want to know the truth? Life is short and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend." They're equally optimistic. They're equally pessimistic. John isn't the bad guy in this. The way this all got started was that John said, "Well, Paul wrote this song and then I wrote the pessimistic part of it. I wrote the part that kind of was down," which is not true. You can't listen to anything John tells you about his own songs, especially if he tells you the song is no good. If he says the song is no good, you better go listen to that song because that song is very vulnerable and very transparent and it's telling you about John Lennon's life and he doesn't want you to listen to it.
Ah, okay.
It's Only Love. It's a horrible song. That song is terrible. Don't listen to it. Yeah, well, because it's embarrassing. Because his marriage is splitting up and his wife he still gets high when he sees her go by. My, oh my. He still loves her. He's still entranced with her, but they're fighting every night, even though the sight of her makes nighttime bright, very bright. I mean, he don't listen to him. We Can Work It Out. Both of them are equally pessimistic. Life is short. Cut out the fighting. It's not going to last very long. You better get right. Instant karma. Paul, why can't you do what I want you to do? I've told you over and over.
See, but this is interesting. You made the comment about Paul. I always saw Paul as the upbeat, happy-go-lucky guy. That wasn't really the case. I mean, was that more his
Um,
image?
I think in real life, Paul is always the PR guy for the band. Like when they are in Scotland and they run into the back of two little old ladies. This is, way back on the Johnny Gentle tour. They hit these two ladies at a stop sign. I guess the driver must have fallen asleep. I don't know. But they run right into them. They say, Paul, get out there and make this right." And sure enough, Paul is out there and "Oh, we're so very sorry." And, and everything is fine. On tour, both 64 and 65, if someone says something in a press conference and it's a little bit gruff, Paul immediately steps in and says, "Oh, well, For example, in San Francisco, they don't have very much police protection. San Francisco has pulled their protection pretty much in 1965. It's difficult getting into the Cow Palace. I told you about them throwing folding chairs on the stage. San Francisco is dangerous. And in between the matinee and the evening show, they do a press conference, and a female reporter says to Ringo, "What do you think about the police protection in San Francisco?" And Ringo goes, "What police?" Paul, you can see him. He goes, "Oh, well, they're good. It's good. It's all good. It's just there could be a few more, you know." I mean, he's always the one to soften the comments of the others. But is he always upbeat? Go back and listen to the songs that he writes for Jane Asher. He is constantly saying, "I am tired of fighting with you. You're not paying attention to me. You're not giving me any time. I'm looking through you. You're not the same. If you don't cut this out, love is a nasty habit of disappearing overnight." He is pretty much mad at her all the time because she's not going to give up her acting career. She is off doing her thing, and that's not what he wants. And they have a very rocky road. And so no one's optimistic all the time.
Right. You can't be. I think Linda McCartney once said he could have a temper, he could get ticked off, which he's human. It's just, he has such a way about him, which I love. I just love, I don't know. It just seems like the reason he's still doing so great as with Ringo, they just have a great attitude about life. They find the good in life, and they gravitate towards that, and they don't get too caught up in the negative. I think maybe that's more of a fair assessment.
I do. I agree with that completely. But the thing is that Paul, once again, Mary McCartney dies of breast cancer, but she loved her boys, and they have a very close family. And Paul always felt loved, and his father adored him, and he was very supportive. And Paul came from nurturing. John came from chaos. Why did my mother leave me here to be raised by this aunt? And he says to his aunt, "Why are you there every day after school waiting for me? Why are you there every day for me, Aunt Mimi?" And she says, "Because it's my duty to do so." And he asks her that every day, and the answer is always the same. If just once she had said, "Because I love you," things might have been different, but that wasn't her answer. So John is more abrupt and more hostile. He's going to be rude to you when he first meets you because he's going to keep you at arm's length. You're not going to hurt him. He's not going to let you get into his life because he's been hurt before, and he's not going to do it. And he says to Tony Barrow, "Well, if you're not," I think he said, a fag, and you're not Jewish, then why are you working for Brian?" Well, it hurt Tony's feelings. But then Tony gets to know the Beatles, and John and he are closer than any of the others. He says, "I love John Lennon like a brother." You got to get to know him. At first, he's going to push you away. He just is abrupt and hostile and mad, and you have to get past that. So they come from different backgrounds.
Well, it's interesting the way this book ends, and there's so much more covered in the book. But as we get towards the end, you write, quote, "It was January 1st, 1966, and John resolved that from here on out, he would tell his mother and his father figures about the nonconformity in his heart. He would speak up, voice his feelings. John Winston Lennon had plenty to say, and in the months ahead, he intended to say it." He's, I believe, 25 years old, right? He seems to be at a turning point in his life as we start the year 1966. So what can we expect to read about John in the next volume, which will be volume 7? She said, is that?
It will actually be volume 6 because Come Forever is the second half of Shades of Life. But
so we're at a real pivotal point in his life now.
66 is going to be a difficult year. I mean, 66 starts off with the Maureen Cleave interview right off the bang in January, and there's no reaction until months later. But, that's going to be one of the first things. And then the making of Revolver. They're going to be in studio working on Revolver for quite a long time. And the songs that John writes on Revolver are nothing like the songs he's written on the other LPs. And then you have that world tour, which is nothing short of tragic. I mean, they go to the Budokan and the people don't feel that it's appropriate that they're playing in this place that has been quiet and has been a sanctuary and has been considered reverent. And they're singing rock and roll in the Budokan, and there's a lot of revolt about that. Go to the Philippines, and you know what happens there. They're almost killed in the Philippines because they don't go to Imelda Marcos's soiree. And it just got the Beatlemans, the Beatle Burns, the fear that they're going to be killed on the 1966 North American tour, the statement by George Harrison at Candlestick Park, I'm not a Beatle anymore. Everything in 66 seems to be falling apart. And it's going to be a very difficult year. But John is going to speak out. Paul is going to speak out. They are going to start talking about their political views. They are going to start talking about Vietnam. They've never been able to speak out. Brian has not let them be controversial. And in 66, they definitely are going to be controversial.
By the way, is it Brian Epstein?
Well, this is what
this is the debate.
It is a debate, but this is what I've always heard, that he was, the family name was Epstein. But then when he went to New York the very first time to try to plan their February 1964 visit to America, he was told that in America it was pronounced Epstein. And he comes back and meets in the White Star with Bob Wooler and says to Bob, according to Bob, from now on, I want to be called Epstein because that's the way they say it in America.
Okay. There we have it. We have it. Until I'm always afraid to say it now because I've heard it said so many different, both ways in so many different. So Some Forever, Shades of Life Part 2, it's out now. So where can people get a copy?
JohnLennonSeries.com. And we only printed 500 books this time. We ordinarily do 1,000 because look, everybody now is ebook. And it's so cool with the ebook because if you see a link in the ebook, like let's say there are thousands and thousands, 4,000 footnotes. If you touch a footnote, it will come up. And there's a link to the press conference that you just read about. You just touch that link and watch the press conference. So the ebooks are really sweeping the world. So we did do 500 copies and we've sold just about half of them.
So the next volume, when can fans expect that? I mean, this takes a while for you to put together, another couple of years, maybe.
It takes 3 years for every book. And the thing that slows it down without a doubt is that the books are written as if you're reading a narrative. It looks like a novel, but because I didn't want people to think that it was fan fiction, I do, which you've alluded to, I list all of the sources. And then I have at the end of every single chapter, footnotes. Tons and tons of footnotes. So basically, I type a sentence, put in a footnote, drop in all of the sources. Womack page this, Lewison page this, Davies page this. Then write the next sentence, footnote, type in all of the sources. It is a slow, laborious process. So it takes about 3 years to put it all together. My husband, like I said, does all the beautiful artwork for the cover, and a named Tim Coulter does the arrangement of the cover and gets everything lined up and looking so good and gets the back done. And he said, this is what you do. Type, 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 the end. Type, 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 type. I've already started the next book, so I have to keep pushing.
Jude Southerland Kessler, thank you so much for coming back on, and we will hopefully see you again in 3 years.
I hope so. Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me back. I truly appreciate it.